Well, a very, very warm welcome to this afternoon's Open News meeting. I'm Matt Dancona. I'm an editor at Tortoise, and it's a delight to welcome you all to this Open News meeting. I think it's an extraordinary measure of how much news and change and upheaval there is in the world today. That we're gathering on the day of what is probably the most consequential presidential election in modern history, but somehow that's also the second story in the bulletins right now, and we haven't even mentioned the unspeakable horrors of what happened in Vienna last night. So there is a huge amount to consider and to reflect upon. But of course, at Tortoise, we always try and cut through the noise and to understand the governing dynamics that are at work beneath the news and the long-term consequences of what is happening, which is very hard on a day like today, which is, an experience of bombardment. And I suspect, depending on what the results, the initial results in the presidential election are in the middle of our night, that process of bombardment is going to continue over the next few days, in the course of which England will go into its second national lockdown. And I want to sort of steer the conversation gently towards that today. We can talk about other things, but I think that it's really interesting. When we came out of the first lockdown, there were so many lessons to be learned about care homes, about the failure of the government to make adequate preparations with PPE, test and trace, and so on. And I think there are things to be said about how the month that they've set aside should be used this time. But also, and in a sense, this is what I'd like to explore more than anything, because I think we can take as a given that there's been a huge degree of incompetence and missed opportunity, what this is going to be like, and what things Tortoise should be looking at now. If, as it were, we're looking at 4 weeks of national lockdown, what are the themes that we should be starting to investigate today, and with a view to reporting in depth with data at the end of the lockdown, to give us a sense of what went right, what went wrong. And so I hope today that you will contribute, and as ever, tell us what is on your mind, what you think, what do you think this, where you think this is heading, what the trajectory is, how you think it will affect yourself, your family, your community, as well as the country as a whole. Bit of housekeeping, as you know, if you'd like to chip in, and I really hope you will, James Wilson is manning personing the chat box and is there to help you in any way he can. And if you want to speak directly, do raise your blue hand by clicking the participants button and then clicking raise hand, and I shall come to you as soon as I can. So just to get things going, there's a couple of polls we've rustled up, and I don't know if we can put the first one on screen now. Okay, so just a very, very basic poll. Do you think this second national lockdown is necessary? So click yes or no now. Can you put it back on screen, or is it as everyone? Yeah. Okay, so very interesting, strong, very strong support for the lockdown, 83 to 17, which is interesting for reasons we can go on and discuss. Okay, could we put the second poll up, please? So do you think the consequences for mental health, domestic abuse, loneliness will be, and other such consequences will be worse this time than they were in the first lockdown? So yes or no. Okay. And again, very striking and strong majority. It will be worse. So we have a kind of combination of compliance and apprehension there, which is, yes, it's necessary, but the consequences will be worse. So I appreciate there's a lot of political anger about what's happened, and I'm sure we will deal with that in one form or another. But I'm keen, if we can, to keep the discussion as focused as possible on what you are anticipating this lockdown to be like, what measures can be taken to make it more bearable, and what the government should be doing. So if I can, I'd love, first of all, to come to my colleague and fellow editor and partner, Giles Whittell, who has been following all manner of aspects of the pandemic since it began, and was very early to identify some of the problems with the vaccine program, but also more recently has had, I think, personal experience of the absurdities of the test and trace system. Giles.
Yes. Matt, you started quite properly by asking us to ask ourselves what we should be asking about this second lockdown. And the first question I wrote down is really just echoing what you just said. Is the government using the time properly? Which is a loaded question as far as I'm concerned, because the overwhelming need is to use it to establish a functioning test, trace, and isolate system, which we do not have now, despite the 12 billion odd that's been spent on it. And yes, my only personal experience here was in Scotland last weekend, where I have two kids at university, both in various forms of lockdown, learning very little, borrowing a great deal. One of them tested positive for COVID while we were up there. So our immediate priority was to get tested ourselves. We were actually socially distanced, walking with him, and he got the text from the testing system up a hill, so it was safe. Good thing and a bad thing. We'll start with the bad thing. Because Scotland, for the time being, is still part of the UK, you go to the uk.gov website to book your test, and the instructions, which I have just photographed, which many of you may have seen. I know my colleague Liz was driven to distraction by this. Who can get a free test? You can only get a free NHS test. Forgive me if I'm repeating what you already know. If you have one of the following applies and it lists the symptoms, who cannot get a free test? You cannot get a free NHS test unless you have symptoms. So I've got to try and stay calm about this, because it makes me very angry. And please, I'm not an epidemiologist. If I've got this wrong and anybody out there can tell me, please tell me, and I'll stop making a fool of myself now and on Twitter. But as I understand it, for the first few days that you have this virus, you're likely to be asymptomatic, but you are still infectious. You are perhaps at your most infectious about 5 days after getting it. So the only way you can know who, and that is why it's so infectious, because of that period before you get symptoms. And the only way you can control the disease is to map it. And the only way you can map it is by knowing who is carrying it but is asymptomatic. And you cannot do that given the current requirements for getting a test on the NHS in this country, unless you lie.
Yes.
Which brings me to the good part. I am perfectly capable of lying. So I lied, and I was in Scotland got a test within 45 minutes, got the results the following day, and I'm negative, and was able to get the train back to London without endangering anybody else, to my full and certain knowledge, the following day. Long-winded way of saying, I hope to goodness that the government is using this month to establish a proper test, trace, and isolate system. It is expensive. It does require mass testing, but other countries have done it. I'll close in a second, but just come back to this amazing case in Qingdao, the Chinese port city where they held the sailing events in the 2008 Olympics. They basically have no new cases in the whole country at the moment, but they had a handful in Qingdao. And in order to make absolutely sure that that didn't turn into a major outbreak, they tested 9 million people, shut down most of the city as well.
So just to be clear, Giles, what you're talking about is what is euphemistically called community tracing, where essentially you have a test system that's available to everyone. I mean, I have to confess that when I first heard about the test and trace system, I assumed that we'd be building up or using that horrible verb the government is on using, ramping up a system where in every significant workplace there would be a test capacity and in other public spaces, so that we could go and get our regular test once a week or whatever it might be, symptomatic or otherwise, and that would enable us to work out if we were, and then a workable app, would contact all those we've been in contact with, and so on and so forth. You're not talking about what we have at all, are you?
What I am talking about as what we need is certainly not what we have.
No, it's close to moonshot.
Right. I'm out of my depth here, but there do seem to be two categories of test out there. The polymerase chain reaction, sort of more or less 100% reliable tests which are being done in this country, but in England have an average return time of about 5 days, by which time they're absolutely useless because you may well have caught it from somebody else elsewhere, even if your result is negative. As Bill Gates has said many times, you need these results within a day, which is why it's so impressive that Scotland is delivering them within a day. And if they can, it beggars belief that we can't. But it may well be that we have a non-specialist in charge, and the system isn't working. But the other category of test, which we try to cover in SenseMaker as they evolve, is sort of quick and dirty, as it were. They have saliva-based tests in airports and schools in Italy, which apparently are 95 rather than 99% accurate, but results in half an hour. We're reporting today on AI, which apparently can tell you with 98.5% accuracy whether you have a COVID cough as distinct from a normal cough. You'll recall that when that first flight flew from Tel Aviv to UAE the other day, everybody on it, including Jared Kushner, was tested with a new instant test developed in Israel. So there are quick and dirty options out there, which it seems to me we would need to be rolling out for a moonshot to become a reality. The final absurdity, however, as reported in the Observer, I think on Sunday, is that we have placed an order for 20 million quick tests, but they're not for people with no symptoms. The whole point of mass testing is you test everyone, especially people without symptoms. I'd love to be told I'm wrong about this, but at present it just seems to be a litany of bog ups that are very bad for my blood pressure.
Well, let's leave your blood pressure to fall. We hope, Giles. Thank you very much. Can we go to Zach J now? Zach, I don't know if you're there. Zach, hello. You're muted, I'm afraid, I think, at the moment. Are you there, Zach? Still on mute. Okay, let's go to my colleague Nimo. Nimo, are you available and around? Hi,
Yeah.
Nimo. Hi.
Hi.
Nimo, great to see you, and also keen to hear from you what you think. What profitable use should the government be making of this space, and how did they fail first time round?
So I mean, we could go on all day about how they failed. There's so many different, like, pretty much in almost every single way. But from the angle that I've been kind of looking at it for the last few months, I've been specifically looking at like immigrant communities, communities like the ones I'm from, and communities of color more broadly. And it seems as though the very beginning, when people unsurprisingly realized that Black and brown communities and immigrant communities were being disproportionately impacted in all kinds of ways by the pandemic. And since obviously we've had discussions about the use of BAME as a category and how it's kind of a bit useless in reality, but a lot of the data that was collected in those first couple of months was just kind of a bit useless because it was so large, it was so broad when they were looking at all these different kinds of people in all these different categories across the country, that like I don't really think that we could have come up with any real solutions. And this time round, I think it will be really important for us to collect data that is specific, that that where we're looking at specific communities, where we are like kind of making sure that we differentiate from different kinds of communities and what they're doing and how they're reacting, the economic impact, and the access to services that these people do have like especially in relation to like those who are living in cities and those who aren't. But yeah, I just don't think that we got it right the first time round, and it was only months and months later that we realized how badly like people of color were suffering in this country because of it, economically and otherwise.
Do you think, that the term BAME has really outlived its usefulness? Because it's used as such a catch-all category by bureaucrats and by the media, I suppose. But actually, it incorporates a whole variety of communities, and to a certain extent, using the heading, the rubric BAME, often conceals as much as it reveals.
Yeah, that's absolutely, like it in my opinion, like there are huge discrepancies in this huge category. There are like the differences between Black communities, even within Black communities, like African communities and Caribbean communities, and then the differences between Pakistani communities and Indian communities and Bangladeshi communities. It's huge, and unless we look at how these things intersect with class, for example, we're not going to get any real answers. I don't really understand how we can like come up with any kind of policy that would have a very good solution when we have this massive category that encapsulates all kinds of people who have come into this country or have been in this country for a long time, or have just come into this country, who are in different economic backgrounds. It just doesn't really make any sense to me. And I think specifically, like, since Black Lives Matter and everything, we've really had to like reckon with how useful this category is in the first place, which was at the beginning, like years and years ago, kind of just a vague statistical category that was used in kind of academic articles, and has now been put into the media vernacular and is very useless in my opinion.
Thanks very much, Nimo. I wonder if we might go to the great Chris Cook, who I can see is being photographed by his personal drone. How are you, Chris?
I'm very well.
So, Maestro, tell us what they should be doing and what they might not be doing.
So I think to pick up on some of the stuff that Giles said, I think the case of the defence for the government for not testing asymptomatic people is that there isn't a generalised problem with false positives, but there will be if you start testing people who don't have symptoms. So you're more. So if you test a subpopulation of people who don't have symptoms, particularly if you do it very soon after they've been exposed, you're more likely to either get a false positive or false negative. It's quite an unreliable test at that point in the disease's life. So I think that would be their case. If you have limited capacity, that's the case for the defence for the government, I think. But they're doing this thing now, though, of mass testing in Liverpool, and they're going to try and sort of get the army to go and knock on everyone's door, it seems, and take part in a test. And I suppose that the hope there has got to be that they find a way of making lockdowns shorter and sharper, so that you can run a if there is another outbreak in Leicester, say, we can condense the whole process to a few weeks of very rapidly identifying where the people who need to be isolated are, giving them the support they need to stay indoors, turning up with food, and hopefully do it in a sort of more comprehensive way than we've been able to do to this point, of just sort of starving the virus out by sort of trying to lock everyone down a bit for a long period. So I guess that's the sort of big hope. I'm quite increasingly skeptical about the ability of any government in the UK to be able to make a test and trace process work at the level of efficiency that it needs to manage a large outbreak. The Germans have basically announced that their outbreak has exceeded the capacity of their test and trace systems, which is why they've triggered a lockdown. If we think of our puzzle as being keeping the disease in a place where we can contain it with whack-a-mole local action, maybe with these sort of Liverpool-style surges of testing, plus test and trace, you're talking about keeping it quite a low level. So that probably means suppressing it hard now, and then having rolling, potentially, every now and then having more national action, but also these very intense sort of local whack-a-mole things, because it's going to be quite a long time until this, even if the vaccines all start coming through in the next few weeks, as for approval, it's going to be quite a long time before we get to a place where everyone we need to be vaccinated is vaccinated, and even then we're going to be managing a lot of vulnerable people for whom the vaccine doesn't trigger the immune response we need. So we have a long road ahead.
And Chris, what do you think journalistically are the priorities for us looking at this? I mean, I guess many of us might have thought this was going to come sooner or later, but now it has. What will be the in the way that, as it were, care homes and the failure of test and trace were amongst the horrors of incompetence during lockdown 1? What should we be keeping an eye on now?
Well, I think there's the sort of immediate and obvious first thing is that it was understandable that it was hard to put together packages to support businesses in this strange circumstances, sort of March, April. I don't understand why we're still having these conversations. I mean, they know what we need to happen. And there's a sort of the oddity of spending, tens of billions of pounds to keep businesses going to this point, to let them fail in the last furlong, is a bit peculiar. It will. I mean, I appreciate that there's sort of a bit of a sunk cost fallacy in sort of thinking in those terms, but actually there are cost benefit analyses we made in March, April about the value of keeping firms going that must still hold and must make the same, same cost benefit work now. Right? If we thought it was only had to get through 6 months ago, and we're willing to pay this amount, it's not clear to me why we wouldn't be willing to pay this amount again. I also think that we must understand the economic dynamics better in terms of just sending cash to people who need it. It's cold, right? It's harder to deal with lots of the things about coronavirus in the cold. People need more money to keep their homes livable in, and it spreads more easily indoors, right? It is a winter disease basically, and this is its first winter. So I think we have to do stuff. Sarania has mentioned universities. I think the universities should go entirely online immediately. I don't understand why they're persisting with keeping, but also we need to keep the young people there for a few weeks as well, because we can't disperse this population of people who've all got the disease back into their middle-aged and older parents' homes. So that we've got ourselves into a really stupid mess with universities. And actually, if we'd kept universities online only from the beginning, once it became clear in September that it wouldn't be possible to run normal courses, we would have had a load of buildings in city centres where we could sequester people. Right? They've literally built this literally self-contained accommodation pods. They're perfect for running quarantine. But anyway.
Thanks, Chris. That's absolutely spot on, especially on the whole point about business and getting money where it's needed, and why are we still asking these questions. I think Louise Jarvis had some very interesting points to make about the sort of difference between short-term and long-term planning. Louise, hi, how are you?
Hi there. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think just my comment is it's yes, we totally do need to plan for the short term and stuff like that, and be putting in measures. This is separate from the testing issue and stuff, but it's just I just think when a country's in sort of like an emergency situation such as the pandemic, then it really reveals any cracks or broken systems, and that to me is really what has come through. It's just like the coming to the fore, just showing the deprivation in so many places, the inequality growth. I really fear for the kids in schools, the educational gap with inequality. So like over the first lockdown, it was like, I think reported private schools were twice as likely to, pupils at private schools were twice as likely to receive online lessons as those in state schools. And just that that gap that is just growing and growing the more that this is happening. But for me, it just exposes the problems of the system that were there. The stuff with the vouchers, the food vouchers for kids. Yeah, we totally need to be dealing with that and do a short-term solution. But we also need to be asking the question is, why are we living in a country with the GDP that we always measure ourselves with, and the wealth of this country, where there are kids that are going hungry, where there are parents who are unable to feed their kids? I mean, you had the UN guys come and do this big report on us, however many years ago that was, and we just kind of brushed it off of like, well, you know, this is the UK, they're telling lies on it. It's just kind of dismissing it. And it's just like, this needs to be a wake-up call. Like after the World War II, you know, we had the Beveridge report and everything, and they brought in the NHS and did so many reforms. That wasn't just because the country had come together and it was great. It's because the systems were not working before, so they needed to do something, and they took that opportunity to do something. And my fear of this government at the moment and where we are as a country is we won't do anything. We'll just continue putting plasters over all these cracks. And yeah, so that's my fear. It's kind of like, yes, we need to do the short term, but if we're not looking at the long term as why have we got this poverty when we're a country as wealthy as we are in the first place, then it's just like, in part, what's the point when the next pandemic or whatever hits, we'll be just in the same place again.
It's ironic, isn't it?
That was positive, wasn't it?
I think one has to be ruthlessly candid actually about this. You know, optimism, you know, is real optimism is always based in realism. It's ironic, isn't it, as well, that you have a government that makes so much play of the brilliance of super forecasters, but seems not to be really capable of any strategic forethought at all.
Mm. Yeah, and is that because of the systems of government as well? Not just, I mean, as I said in my thing, it's not just about the current government that we have in place, but oh boy, they are. Yeah, anyway, but actually it's successive governments. And when it becomes successive governments of both colours and all parties and everything in between, then you've got to start thinking the system's broken. It's not about the people necessarily in it. The system is broken. So we need to start looking at the system. What that means is sort of like, that's a big question. But to me, it's more than just the party that happened to be in at the time, because the system has been going for a while.
I mean, you're right, completely right, in the sense that the only value of the only dividend of something as horrible as this is the lessons that you learn from it. Just pivoting, but not really pivoting actually. I mean, staying at the heart of it. I wanted to come to my fellow partner and editor, Liz Mosley. Liz. one of the horrors of first lockdown, which was predicted by various groups and horribly did come to pass, was a measurable increase in domestic abuse and violence. And though unrelated, it's literally the Johnny Depp verdict kind of reminds us all of how appalling that can be, and how women have to go through essentially a public experience to say what traumas they've been through. What's your sense of what this might be like this time round, and are there any, to your knowledge, are there any sort of measures being taken to monitor, prevent, minimize, prosecute this problem? Because it seems to me that it really was one of the most shocking failures of lockdown 1.
Yeah, I mean, the official advice, the government page hasn't been updated since October the 13th. So officially what the government says is they have clarified, which they didn't to begin with actually in the first lockdown, that if you have to leave your home because you're escaping a domestic abuse environment, then obviously that's okay to do. And then they direct you to the National Domestic Abuse Helpline. So that hasn't changed since the announcement the other week. There was provision made available, there was funding made available in the first lockdown for the dramatic increase in particularly women and children who left their homes, and they were put up in various hotels and things where the refuges couldn't accommodate them. I can't find anything, it may be there, but from my looking this morning, I can't find anything to say that it's been supplementary additional funding for this notionally short period of lockdown. So that's one thing. Another thing that has changed since the first lockdown, although it won't practically impact anybody in that situation now, is of course the domestic abuse bill has made its way through the Commons, and it was beginning of March that it had its reading, and then it kind of made its way through the system and out the other end in July. It hasn't gone to the Lords yet, but it's sort of, in terms of lurking in the background, a step forward. It's not perfect, the bill. There are omissions, migrant women, revenge porn, crimes committed by women in abusive relationships, and so on. So the sort of the machinery of support is cranking up in the background, but it doesn't help you today, is the first thing to say. I suppose the second thing to say, in the context of the Johnny Depp thing, it sort of seems slightly odd given the momentousness of the day and everything else we've been talking about, to be talking about Johnny Depp, but it is important. And there's a weird symmetry with the fact that our file this week has talked about J.K. Rowling, in that the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, which was of course a libel case, sort of starts with J.K. Rowling, weirdly, in that the headline that the case was brought against, appeared in The Sun, was, how can J.K. Rowling be genuinely happy casting wife-beater Johnny Depp in the next Fantastic Beasts movie? That was the specific headline when they referred to him as a wife-beater. Although actually the framing, and this is where I went through my mind when thinking about how I was going to comment on this today, the framing of that headline actually puts J.K. Rowling in the position of the baddie, not wife-beater Johnny Depp. Yes. How can she be happy having him in her big fat movie?
How can this woman who was the victim of domestic abuse have the audacity to...
as the Times referred to her in their write-up, which was today, claims herself to be a victim of domestic abuse. That's their framing. And really, this is the thing that I come back to, which is the judge ruled in the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case that it was appropriate to refer to him as a wife beater on the basis if he found 12 of the 14 instances where he was sexually or physically abusive to her. He found that he believed her, basically, because it did come down to her testimony. And it's very unusual that those sorts of cases end up going the way of the victim of the abuse. It is less likely, right? Because it's very hard to prove. And there is the most extraordinary programme, which I urge anybody who has an interest in these matters to watch, on BBC 3 at the moment. I think it's been out for a couple of days. It's called Is This Coercive Control? Now, coercive control, of course, is a particular sort of abuse, different from the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard form of abuse. And it is a completely fascinating and terrifying experiment with 20 young people, mixture of boys and girls and non-binary people, watching a sort of drama play out. It's a fictional story of a relationship, and they are asked to comment on whether they believe that the behaviour of either member of the couple is abusive, whether it would qualify as a crime, and they see it through, and they see through this sort of fictional court case. It is completely chilling. It is totally chilling watching these young people react to what they can see, physically see, and say, I think that's normal, I think it's fine. Oh, she just seems a bit emotional. You know, it is the most extraordinary thing. And it's not
Where
that
can we see this? Sorry, where can we see this?
Such.
Where can we see this, Liz?
It's on the iPlayer, it's on BBC Three.
It's on there, right.
Yeah. It's really worth watching because that's right, Louise has just posted the link. And if you read through, as I had this morning, really carefully, the coverage of the case, the Johnny Depp and Amber Heard case, the linguistic framing is extraordinarily in favour of him. The same thing has just happened. Ryan Giggs, right? The BBC headline that's just gone live 20 minutes ago, Ryan Giggs denies allegations of assault. I'm sorry, that's wrong. The headline is Ryan Giggs accused of assault. Yeah. I don't care that he denies it. That's the wrong way around to see it. And I think that this is the thing I feel exercised about, which is I'm thrilled about the domestic abuse bill. I'm terrified for the people facing another 4 weeks of lockdown with abusive partners. But that overall, culturally, I think we've got a long way to go before the default expectation is to believe the person who is being abused, not to defend their abuser. Okay,
this is really important. So first question is, what can Tortoise do in the next? Are there any groups that we can partner with to monitor this as it's happening? Because it seems to me that last time, you know, there were people who were saying this is going to happen, and indeed it did. And I think that there were 5 murders. Am I right? I mean, it was an absolutely appalling number. So question 1, what should we be doing journalistically now? Second question is a slightly more broad one, which is there seem to be, with these issues of justice and common decency, there seem to be tipping points, and I can't explain why they happen, but Me Too is one, you know, where things that have been going on for millennia suddenly, in a way that was rather, in a sense, rather insulting, but also brilliant, became a sudden global, there was a global sort of explosion of interest in them, and at least the beginnings of a change in behavior and culture, emphasis on beginnings. Ditto the George Floyd lynching in May. You know, it won't have, you know, we're in the foothills of change, but it was a major punctuation mark in the understanding of white people about white privilege and the institutional racism and the need to address racial justice through that prism. Huge moments. Now, I don't think that the Johnny Depp case will, huge as it is, and much as he is a massive Hollywood star who's now disgraced, I suspect that won't have the equivalent effect for domestic abuse. Do you agree with that? Or
I absolutely agree. Although it will, the fact that Amber Heard was believed, he'll appeal it. I mean, he's already said he's going to appeal it. But the fact that she could go in, a powerful, admittedly, actress and beautiful and all the rest of it, but she was able to go in and tell her story and be believed, that will give some comfort to all of the thousands, I'm afraid millions of women who are fearful of doing that. But I don't believe it will be a tipping point, no.
And journalistically, what should we be doing?
I mean, it's a good question. You know, Phoebe suggested the analysis and, you know, the framing. We've done primary sources before that are very helpful, but that's not new. It has been done a lot. Lots of feminist linguistics have done that. I mean, the Centre for Women's Justice is very good. We Can't Consent to This are very good. I think those are the people that would be helpful for us to access perhaps data points, perhaps untold stories. And, you know, we are already in conversation with various people who have stories about institutional cultural barriers in the police that prevent cases even before they get to the court.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that would be a door to really push hard against if we can.
No, definitely. No, definitely. Thanks very much, Liz. I wanted to come to Merapy. If you're there, Merapy, I don't know if you're. Are you?
I am here.
Okay, hi. Again, good to see you. And I wondered if you could sort of give us some Merapy wisdom on what you think this lockdown is going to be like in terms of its texture and its impact, because my hunch is that it's going to be very different from lockdown 1, but I'd love to know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think our polls at the start of this showed that everyone thought that. There was a sense going into lockdown 1 that I think some people quite welcomed the break from real life, as it were. I know I did. The weather was lovely, and now when it becomes real life, that this is real life, it doesn't seem quite as joyful. I saw a meme the other day that my husband and I laughed about, because it said, "Oh, this is awful." Had a sort of circular thing. This is awful. Could be worse. This is awful. Could be worse. And that's the sort of loop I feel like everyone's going on at the moment, because, you know, I do feel like, well, this is awful. It's necessary. It's awful. It could be worse. I'm not a victim of domestic violence, as Liz was talking about. You know, so many people losing their jobs, and you feel like you're constantly putting your own sort of issues in perspective about it all. In terms of the mood of everyone, I sort of feel like most people feel it's necessary. Also feel that people will be less obedient this time, and probably less judgmental of the people who are less obedient. That sort of feels to me the mood around where I am. But one of the interesting things I think is, I mean, we've talked about domestic violence. We also, Matt, you mentioned to me about suicide rates in the young before this, and there's also been there was a huge sort of uptick around May of suicide rates in the elderly as well. The Royal College of Psychiatrists had one trust with a 6-fold increase in suicides in the very elderly, and you can see that might be an issue and something that Tortoise could look at in the next in lockdown 2. But yeah, on a lower level, I find one of my friends mentioned to me that she had low-level agoraphobia at this point, in the sense that she hasn't gone out and she started to sort of not want to go out as well. And this morning there's a piece on pandemic fatigue in the Times, and it talked about that sort of cycle of loneliness, that people feel lonely, but they feel lethargic because of that loneliness, and then they're less inclined to want to contact people, and then they feel lonelier. And that seems like the cycle that we might be heading into.
Yes, it's interesting. I was talking to a psychiatrist the other day about this whole issue, and he's interesting because he normally treats combat veterans, but in recent months his entire practice has shifted to victims of what he's calling COVID trauma, and he said that some of the symptoms of PTSD for special forces who have been in Kabul and Kandahar and places like that are actually not very different to the post-traumatic symptoms that ordinary civilians are experiencing this time. And interestingly, this was before Boris Johnson's announcement on Saturday, but he said, well, if there is a second lockdown, it'll be like another tour in Vietnam for people, which I thought was quite alarming, but a very interesting way of framing it. And his point was that the trauma often doesn't manifest itself until you're out of the lockdown or the conflict zone, which means that there's a legacy beyond the actual restrictive period itself. But actually, looking at it from a journalistic point of view, I mean, one thing we should ask you, Merapy, is to talk about our COVID inquiry. because that's already, you know, an important undertaking.
So we have coming up, and hopefully people on this call will have signed up. And if you haven't, please do join us on 3 consecutive Fridays, the 20th of November, the 27th of November, December the 4th. We are doing an inquiry into the government's handling of COVID, and the first day is broadly based around the first peak. The second day, November the 27th, is broadly the sort of summer lull and the wasted opportunity. And the last day is broadly this second peak. And I can see the people in the chat are talking about the mental health, the sort of silent secondary pandemic of coronavirus, you know, the mental health that we were just discussing, which I really think will be the distinguisher of this second lockdown. And that is one of the sessions. The sort of second inside the NHS session. There's one on the first day, which looks at how prepared the NHS was. And on the last day, we're looking at inside the NHS and the second pandemic, whether that's, you know, people not being treated for cancer or other illnesses, or the mental health crisis. So please do join us for that if you have opinions or experiences, and we welcome any witness submissions from that.
Great. Thanks so much, Mary P. I wonder if we could come to Sarania. I don't know if you're there.
I am. I must say this is my first one of these, so like, hi.
Well, you're very welcome, and thank you so much for contributing. You were making some very interesting points in the chat, and I wondered if you wanted to, rather than me try bunglingly to paraphrase them, if you wanted to repeat them, because they were fascinating.
I feel like I made a lot. Shall I talk about kind of
trauma? You were talking about trauma and so on, and I think that, and mental health, and I thought that was,
yeah, like this is the main thing I guess I'm talking about with my friends, is like I'm talking like, this is me and my friends personally, like haven't, like in the kind of, we haven't been affected, as in like none of us have really had it badly. I've never had it. I've got some friends who have had COVID, not really been that bad. We've not known anyone who's died. So on the big scale of things, like we've actually been okay, but we're all still really struggling. Everyone's really struggling with their mental health. Like I've just finished a course of like therapy because I hit quite bad like COVID anxiety, and it really wasn't very fun. And my friends were just saying, no, it's okay, thanks. But like, it's the constant like not knowing, and it's the to and the fro, and the being told this thing and then being told this thing, and not knowing and having no control. And I don't know what PTSD feels like, but we think that this is something that we're all going to be feeling for a while. And I think someone was saying like, it might not hit us, what we feel now might not even be the worst that we're going to feel. Like it might be that next year or the year after is when it all kind of really hits and everyone just kind of spirals, or like, because I feel like like I said, I've not really been affected, but if someone like me who's not really been affected is struggling this much, and I can't imagine how hard it must be for anyone who has been affected. But yeah, that was just my thoughts.
And have you felt supported at various levels? I mean, not just by individuals and families, but by, you know, public services, and that there is do you feel there is an infrastructure out there to come to your help? Because I think that a lot of us are going to need that infrastructure, and to your point earlier, not just in December, January, February, but a year from now.
I don't think so, but also the answer is I don't know, because I don't think people know. Like, I don't think people in power know. I don't think the NHS knows, or the government knows, or I don't think when I needed to self-refer, I did, using a really easy form on the NHS website, and I was only waiting for 2 or 3 weeks to start Zoom therapy. So like that was really lucky, and I can't imagine how hard it would have been if the waiting list had been as long as it has been when therapy was all in person. So from that point of view, it's actually been okay. But then I've got loads of friends who were put on furlough, and their organizations just didn't support them at all. So they were put on furlough and just kind of abandoned in furlough and had nothing really to like keep them going. People that have like lost jobs and like are still struggling to find new ones. So in some ways, like there doesn't seem to be much out there. But like I said, then personally, when I tried to get therapy, like that happened really quickly. I also just remembered something, like I've also got a friend, quite a good friend, who's a primary school teacher, and a friend who's a doctor in hospital. And I think like they don't feel, kind of both of their points of view, and I saw them a couple of weeks ago, was that it's just kind of unfair that like they both have to still, they're both putting their lives online technically, they're both key workers, but they can't have a life outside their jobs. Like they're giving up a lot, like they both love what they do and they're giving up a lot, but then like one of them can't get married but has to go into, there's like no support basically for them to like have a life. They're just expected to do
yeah, exactly. And I think, I mean, it's not an original point, but that there is undoubtedly a generational dimension to this, which is that younger people are, they may not be paying with their lives in as greater numbers as the old generation, but they are certainly paying a price at a time, at a formative time, you know, where you'd expect, as you say, you know, people are getting married and they want to have social lives, and they're developing their careers, and suddenly all of these pressures come storming in all at once.
And that's, I think, like, you know, when they were announcing, the government announced kind of the rules around support bubbles and how you can kind of like bubble if you live by yourself or if you're a single parent, and they kind of thought about all these things, but I don't think they've thought about a young person who lives in a flat share with a bunch of strangers. Like I'm in that situation. Like I live in a flat share, an overpriced flat share in London, and I don't live with my support network. So like I can't really like see, or like I just don't think it's fair that your household is, I think your household is very different to your support network, and I don't think it's fair that the people that don't live with their support network can't then have access to it, basically.
No, it's very very, very important, and very important heading into lockdown too. Thank you so much. Trying to come to Jennifer Allerton now. Jennifer, I don't know if you're online there. Hi, Jennifer. How are you?
Hello, yes, I am, but I just realised my laptop is very low on charge, so I'm running up
Okay.
to my room where the charger
Yeah.
is. So
a mobile
through the house in the dark.
Thank you very much.
Um,
No, you made a point about your last, the last year, which I thought sort of was almost like a haiku for in the chat, which is almost like a sort of haiku for describing, what the last year has been like, and wondered if you could speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, so this time last year in 2019, it feels like it's so much more than a year ago. But yeah, this time last year, I was about 2.5 months into a new job, which I was absolutely loving. Yeah, doing well, like learning how to get on with everything. And I started to have a bit more responsibility in the role in January and February. I was running some of the projects, doing more project management, which was like, it was a bit outside of my comfort zone, but I had the support there. I was in the office with my colleagues. I knew I could turn around and chat to someone, and I knew I had the support and I could feel it. And yeah, and then lockdown came and everything was a lot harder. And because we were an online communications company that primarily ran science engagement activities for school groups online, so we had suddenly a lot more work starting in March and April, and myself going from the most junior person in the company, it's a very small group of about 6 of us in the office most days, so well, between 4 and 6 of us. So yeah, I'd been the most junior person starting there in August last year, and then suddenly I was trying to run massive, completely different projects to whatever we'd done before. My mental health plummeted. I wasn't seeing people every day. I wasn't near my family. I moved house at the beginning of March. And so I'd been with the people that I lived with for 2 weeks when lockdown started, 2 or 3 weeks. Yeah, and it was just very hard. My boss was incredibly supportive, and I did have to go on sick leave for a little while at a time, more than once. But in the end, in September, I decided to move back from where I was living in Bath, Wiltshire, to Essex, where I now am with my parents, and quit my job completely, which was the job that I loved, because I had a full-time job. It's not like I could take furlough, because it was there for me. I could do the job if I had been able to. Yes. But because my illness was a mental health illness and not COVID, I didn't get extra payment. I was just on sick pay for the time that I was off. And I thought, I know if I stay on sick pay for any longer, I can't pay rent. So that's why I chose to move back here. And
yes, I'm,
very devastating.
Well, yes, and I'm very sorry. And I also, there's an irony in that, although your illness was not, strictly speaking, COVID, it was the product of the pandemic, wasn't it? I mean, it was a direct consequence of the situation that
to a large extent. I mean, I've suffered with mental health difficulties for a long time, but it was largely that, and my ability to access kind of treatment and therapies was a lot less during that time as well, because no one knew what was happening, and a lot of the normal places were closed. So it's quite a bit harder.
Well, thank you for speaking so candidly, and we wish you all the best. And for contributing. Sadly, we're drawing to the close of the hour, and it's I've really learned a lot, actually, and I think that there's a huge a sort of inventory of things that we at Tortoise need to go away and think about and address. I mean, Giles's point about the absolute imperative to get test and trace sorted, conscious of the fact that experience so far suggests that's unlikely to happen, but nonetheless it has to remain an ambition on the books. And then Chris too, I think, raised a really good point about the need to get money where it's needed, and let's worry about the borrowing later, but also the puzzling failure of so many of the business schemes still to get the money where they were needed. And why is this so? I think it's very rich territory, I think, for us. Also, what Nimo said about the inutility of BAME as a category, and the need to gather good, solid data on specific communities and the way that they are suffering during this lockdown and beyond, I think is an absolutely key point. And given the two huge themes of 2020 have been the pandemic and racial injustice, it's an inarguable point, and one that we should certainly pursue hard. Liz, I think so important that the whole question of domestic abuse, and not just confined to the next 4 weeks, but also raising consciousness on this, that this is a major social pathology that hasn't yet, in spite of the legislation, and it's a good start, but it's not enough. It hasn't yet achieved the kind of critical mass in terms of public awareness that it needs to, and it is such an important thing. And I think that it's something we should be looking at, both in the context of COVID, but crucially beyond. And the Johnny Depp case, as Liz said, it's fascinating, and the way it's framed, and J.K. Rowling issue was framed, and now even gigs. There is always a way in which it is framed that is extremely and depressingly eloquent. Thanks to Tamarapi for the points you made, and also for pointing us in the direction of the inquiry. And we do hope that everyone will come along and participate in that. It's a very important part of our end of year project, and I think it's going to be an extremely fruitful one. There was so much else I can mention, but we're already 2 minutes beyond. So thank you so much for attending. Take care of yourselves and have a very good afternoon. Thank you.